Hello, welcome to gusmcdoll's Strategy and Tactics, and thank you to our subscribers. In this series, we play through the 16 operations of the German Grand Campaign in Close Combat 3, the Russian Front. Please remember to subscribe, comment, and like the video. And if you want to show your support with a donation, the links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. A slightly shorter episode today before we commence the E14 campaign in the next episode. The campaign involves a long-awaited counterattack against the Russians east of the Dnieper River. But for now, I want to introduce you to a feature of the game, perhaps a hidden feature or at least a lesser known feature. The command screen has a button labelled History. When you click on this button, it opens the campaign map. Each campaign location indicated on the map has a red button. If you right-click on the screen element, you get a brief history of the campaign. So, I want to share the campaign briefings so far. In our first battles, we experienced Operation Barbarossa in Blitzkrieg. These were part of the Lviv campaign. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact created an uneasy peace in Eastern Europe that both sides knew would not last. Stalin hoped that the German attack would not come until 1944 or later, when the rebuilding Russian army would be ready for them. Unfortunately, Hitler launched his attack in late June 1941, when the Russian troops on the frontier were completely unprepared. Their orders were to avoid provoking the Germans at all costs. This meant withholding fire or taking any other significant military actions until it was too late. Stalin was stunned by the suddenness and ferocity of the attack and by the extent of his own miscalculation. Secluding himself in a villa outside Moscow, Stalin left his troops to their fate for days. Finally, he emerged, and Stavka attempted to organise the defence. However, years of purges and antiquated weaponry could not be corrected overnight. The German forces drove through Russian defences at will, turning aside only to encircle large numbers of Russian troops. These great encirclement battles led to the annihilation of virtually all of the first line of Russian troops. Fortunately, the poor armament of these troops meant that the material losses were actually less devastating than they appeared to the German army. By the end of July, the German army was well ahead of its schedule, and the German General Staff confidently predicted that the war would be over by the winter. Later, we experienced Operation Typhoon in Roads to Moscow and Moscow Retaliates. These were part of the Moscow campaign. The annihilation of Russian troops in the summer of 1941 seemed to herald a swift conclusion to the war. The German General Staff could not imagine that the Russians could suffer such horrific losses and still field a credible fighting force. After the Battle of Kiev, where the Russians lost over 600,000 men, the Germans turned back towards Moscow to administer the coup de grace. It was important to end things quickly, as German logistics were not prepared for a protracted war or for one to be fought in the winter. Troops lacked boots and clothes to withstand the cold, and German equipment froze up and failed to operate in the freezing temperatures that were now imminent. On the Russian side, full mobilization had taken hold, and millions of men and women were being hurried through enlistment and into new defensive lines. Citizens were mobilized to create barricades and strongpoints around Moscow and Leningrad. Battle-hardened troops from Siberia were railed into Moscow thanks to a pact between the Russians and the Japanese. Moreover, the newest Russian tanks, the T-34 and the KV-1, were arriving in large numbers. Both were superior to anything the Germans had in the field. In October, the Germans launched Operation Typhoon with the intent of taking Moscow. In the north, troops got within sight of the spires of the Kremlin before the terrain, poor logistics, and the tenacious Russian defence stopped them. In the south, Guderian drove north and east of Tula, heading towards the southern edge of Moscow, attempting to bypass the toughest Russian defences. But poor weather and stiffening resistance stopped his panzer army well short of Moscow. In December, Stavka went over to the offensive. The shock to the previously invincible German army was extraordinary. The Germans were unprepared for winter warfare and assumed that offensive operations were impossible. They were wrong, and were quickly thrown back from Moscow. German troops were forced to form hedgehog defences around strongpoints, leaving the countryside free to roaming Russian troops who swept behind them and inflicted significant losses on rear area troops and isolated units. Moscow was never to be threatened again by the German army. Next episode, we will experience Operation Frederikus in the Second Battle of Kharkiv in the Izium campaign. From now on, I will include these campaign briefings as we go forward. But for now, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and donate, and stay tuned for the next episode.